What I'd like to do is begin by sharing a poem. I really love poetry and often feel like the other arts are underused, so I've been trying to figure out ways to share more poetry, but this one really is appropriate and immediately leapt to my mind as I thought about what I wanted to speak on this week. So this is by Robert Frost, and it is called Acquainted with the Night. I have been one acquainted with the night. I've walked out in rain and back in rain. I have outwalked the furthest city light. I have looked down the saddest city lane, and I have passed by the watchman on his beat and dropped my eyes, unwilling to explain. I have stood still and stopped the sound of feet when far away an interrupted cry came over houses from another street, but not to call me back or say goodbye. And further still, at an unearthly height, one luminary clock against the sky proclaimed the time was neither wrong nor right. I have been one acquainted with the night. Robert Frost often wrote poems about grief and the process of grieving. And I believe this poem is about grief and the emptiness that comes with that, and the feelings of sadness, and sometimes being overwhelmed with emotion. And the reason I chose that poem, I have been one acquainted with the night, is because I have been one acquainted with grief. I have been one acquainted with grief in what feels like an overwhelming way. When I was in third grade, a good friend of mine died on the playground right in front of my eyes. I knew he had heart problems. We all knew he had open heart surgery. We're playing soccer. He collapses. The person on duty did a fantastic job of trying to perform CPR. They took all the kids obviously in, but I stood there. I wouldn't leave. I don't know why. And that was the first funeral I ever attended. And then in high school, I had a beloved piano teacher that passed away, and I remember visiting him in the hospital. My grandfather passed away. When we were just out of college, my father-in-law passed away at a young age. And then the first funeral I did as a pastor was for a baby that was born premature. And I can't tell you how many funerals I've done since then. In all different kinds of places, all different people, children, teenagers, people in their midlife, people older, people that died by accident, by disease, by natural causes, by suicide. I even did a funeral for a young man from Hartford who went on vacation in the Caribbean and went missing. Nobody ever knew what happened to him. Body never recovered, never found, but we did a funeral service in the lobby of the Oakdale Theater for 400 people in the music industry. Sometimes as a pastor, you have to do funerals because you're available. And I remember one time at Trinity doing two funerals. Was one your mother's funeral and another one? And my whole thought was, please don't mix up the names. Please remember the names of which funeral you're doing, because you've got two back to back. And it's a sobering thing to stand in those places. And then this past week, and this is where I'm just going to be vulnerable and real with you this morning. A friend of mine who was a pastor in Waterbury passed away last Sunday. Reverend Antoine Richardson was 38 years old. 38 years old. Unexpected, sudden, devastating. We had great conversations over the years. We talked about things that only we could talk about together. And what I've learned in this long and extensive experience with grief is that it's never just the grief of that moment or that person, but it taps you into the deeper grief. It taps you into the grief of all those that you've loved and lost. And it reminds you that grieving is still there. The grieving's not a season that you pass through, but it's something that remains with you in somewhere, because you hear a story like this, and I'm getting emotional, and if anyone else is getting emotional, it's not because my friend died, but it's because of the grief in your life. It's because of the things that you've lost or that you're afraid to lose. Because every grief taps us into that deeper grief that exists within inside of us. I've even done the funeral of my own father and my own mother-in-law and one of my best friends, several of my best friends. So Antoine's passing wasn't just about Antoine. It was about Gerald and Brother E and Laura Cruz. And those were the things that came to my mind. For you see, I believe that there is this larger grief that we all live in. And by that, I mean grieving is not just losing someone you love or someone that you knew. Grief is losing anything. There's grief when you lose a job at the end of a career. And I think that people who retired enter a grieving process and nobody talks about it. Because you're grieving the loss of a career. You're grieving the loss of a job. You grieve the loss of dreams. You grieve the loss of seasons. When you graduate from a school or an institution, there's a grieving process because you're leaving something behind. And that's what this life is. We're always leaving something behind. Even as kids, you grieve the loss of recess when you get older. I'm not kidding. There are things that you leave behind, right? And how often do we have those moments of nostalgia where we long for something in the past? You know, and what we do with it is we often let it turn into anger that things aren't the way they used to be, instead of understanding that even anger is part of that grieving process. And that we need to learn to let go and to grieve and to move on, because all of life is a grieving process. David said it in Psalm 23. He said, even though I walk through the valley of the deepest darkness, what used to be translated the valley of the shadow of death. Right? That is the experience. Do you notice, if you read on in that psalm, that he never leaves the valley? He's in the valley of the shadow of death throughout the whole rest of the story, until I shall dwell in the house of God forever. You see, again, we think that grief or loss is a season, but it's an experience. We always will live in the valley of the shadow of death. In fact, what grief does for you, this is strange, it actually expands your soul. It actually creates that emptiness, kind of expands your heart and your soul. And it gives you space. When you lose something, it creates a space in your life. So part of that process is realizing, well, now there's something larger inside of me. There's a greater capacity for me to maybe handle things or to experience things or to be able to move through things differently. For life is lived in the valley of the shadow of death. That's where you make life. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to go over the mountains. And I don't mean here in New England. I'm from Colorado. That's where the real mountains live. Whether you're driving through the mountains or hiking through the mountains, which I've done both, to get through the mountains, the path becomes very narrow. There's not a lot of space. You're pretty restricted. And when you get to the top of a mountain, it is a spectacular view. But there's not much space to move around. But down in the valley, there's room. It's where it opens up. And there's fields where you can plant crops. And there's land where you can build houses. And there's water where you can build cities and raise children. Life is lived in the valley, not on the mountaintops. The mountaintops are for a moment. And there's not much room when you're at the top of the mountain. But when you come down off their high mountain and you learn to live in the valley, you learn there's space to move, and there's space to live, and there's space to grow. And that grief creates that space. Why do I say our entire life is a grieving process? Because why would we hold on to that which is temporary? Why would we hold on to that which is temporary? Why would we not learn early on to let things go, to grieve, to let it go, to let it be absent from our life, and trust that in that space that grief creates, that God is working? Back to the song by David in Psalm 23, it's in the valley of deepest darkness that a table is set before us in the presence of our enemies. It's in the valley of grief that our head is anointed with oil. It's in your darkest, saddest, deepest times that your cup overflows. And it's in that valley of the shadow of death that goodness and love are pursuing you every single day of your life. So the opportunity becomes in my grief, in my sadness, in my anger, in my frustration. Can I look around and see that things are happening in this valley, in this space that's been created in my heart? You know what I'm talking about. If you've lost anyone, you know you describe it as an emptiness, right? There's an emptiness in your heart. There's an emptiness in your soul. But it's in that space that God creates life, that we live. We have to live. We can't get around it. We can't get away from it. It's what awaits us all. And grief is an experience of our life in many levels. And even though it's amazing to think about all of the things that God does for us in the valley of the shadow of death, I forgot the most important thing. And I forgot it on purpose because I wanted it to serve as my transition. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will what?
Fear no.
Little louder.
Fear no.
Why? Because you are with me. I will fear no evil because you are with me. Friends, that's a mantra. I don't know, you might need to write that down. You might need to put it on your screensaver. But think about how your perspective would change if every day you said, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Whatever room you have to walk into, whatever danger or threat or sadness or anger is waiting for you in that room, you say, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. For the most amazing thing is that the God, the creator of the universe, has chosen to be with us in our pain, in our suffering, in our darkest of days, in the deepest part of our valley. And one of the most amazing examples of this truth for me is the story that's recorded in the Gospel of John, chapter 11, when Jesus' best friend Lazarus has died. And so for my text, I want to use the simplest and shortest of verses in the scriptures, John 11:35. I'm sure someone knows the shortest verse in the Bible, right? Jesus wept. Yet in those two words, there is a world of significance. In those two simple words, there is power beyond what we can imagine. Jesus wept. He cried. Heavy, sobbing tears. So we see that in Jesus, God just doesn't observe our pain or understand our pain or even sympathize with our pain or empathize with our pain, but Jesus actually, in a radical act of solidarity, feels the pain with us as one of us. And friends, that is a powerful, powerful truth that we proclaim this morning. Jesus was with us in his sadness and in his grief. And of course, I like to tell people, if it's okay for Jesus to cry, it's okay for us to cry. In fact, it's our tears that water the soil of our heart. It's our tears that we sow. Psalm 126 says, those who sow in tears will reap in songs of joy. That our tears water the soil of our heart and what lies within there. Tears are okay. It's okay to cry. It's okay to cry. And Jesus had heard that his best friend Lazarus had died. And 4 days later, he comes with his friends. And Lazarus' sister Martha comes out first. And Martha comes to Jesus and says, Lord, if you had been here, you could have saved him. And in that one sentence, she captures the prayer of billions of people throughout history. The prayer you and I have had in our hearts. God, when are you going to show up? Why didn't you show up? God, where are you? Why aren't you here? And Jesus receives all of her frustration, and he absorbs all of her anger, and he is present to every single emotion that she is going through. Anger and sadness and grief. And then Mary, his other sister, comes out with the same plea, with the same cry. And this time Jesus doesn't even engage in conversations because Jesus knows that there's a time to speak and there's a time to be silent. And this time he doesn't say anything, but he says, take me to the place where they laid him. And in that place, Jesus wept. Even believing in the resurrection of life doesn't keep you from experiencing sadness and grief. Because Martha said she believed in the resurrection at the end of time, but that didn't keep her from being angry and sad at God. And I want to tell you, Martha is a patron saint if there ever was one. I mean, Martha is a saint in every sense of the word. And here's the good news this morning. She was a saint who was grumpy, frustrated, jealous, angry, sad. All the while, she is a saint. So take courage, Christians. If you happen to be a grumpy Christian or a frustrated Christian or an angry Christian or a sad Christian, all of those things are completely okay. It's okay not to be okay. And Jesus chose to enter into all of that sadness. He said he was troubled in his spirit. Like a word that's just fascinating to try to translate. There was some kind of emotion swelling up in him, almost like a storm that was gathering, right? And even though Jesus knew what he was going to do, he still took the time to weep, to grieve. Friends, if anyone here is grieving for any reason this morning, take that time to grieve. Don't try to get over it or tell anyone to get over it. Because our life is a grief, but it can be a grief well lived in the hope and promise of resurrection. For what lies in the soil of our heart is the seed of hope. And so when our tears water the soil of our heart, they're watering that seed of hope. And Jesus wanted us to have confidence in that. He wanted them to have confidence. And so he decides to do the most amazing miracle that he's done yet. The one that's going to blow every other miracle away. The one that's really going to cause an upheaval. And he comes to the place where they laid him and he said, roll away the stone. And again, old Saint Martha, the practical one, what does she say? In the old King James, but Lord, he stinketh. You get the feeling Martha was someone who told it like it was, right? She didn't miss no words. She's like, okay, Jesus, we do whatever you want, but it's going to smell, you know. And he said, roll the stone away, nevertheless. So they rolled the stone away. He says, Lazarus, come out. Lazarus walks out in his grave clothes. Jesus is like, take off the grave clothes. Can you just for a minute, right? Put yourself there. How many people fainted when that happened? How many people had a heart attack when that happened? How many people ran away scared and screaming like when that happened, all right? I mean, how many people thought, what's in this drink that I'm drinking? I mean, it had to be chaos. It had to be mayhem. I mean, the flood and the mixture of emotions was probably just beyond our comprehension. And I believe in that moment, Jesus looks at Martha, and she remembers what he had said to her when he first arrived. I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me, even though they die, yet shall they live. And what Jesus did with his own resurrection is that he showed us that death is not a dead-end street, that the tomb is not a locked room with no way out. But when Jesus rose from the dead, he blew out the back wall of the grave, amen? And he said, no longer is this the end, but I have power and authority over death. And he wanted them in that moment to believe that if he could do it for Lazarus, he was going to raise from the dead himself. That no matter what happened to him, they should hold on to that seed of hope and go ahead and cry. Holding on to the seed of hope doesn't mean you act like everything's okay. It means you cried. It means you get angry. And it means you feel empty. And it means sometimes you feel abandoned. And sometimes you feel alone. But fear no evil, because God is with you. God is with you. And God will always be with you. And here's the funny part, right? To me, Lazarus had to die again. Can you imagine? Dude died once. Jesus brings him back to life. Excuse me. Everybody's happy, probably all excited, right? I just hope, this is just me, okay? This is just me. I just hope that Lazarus was asleep. Because if he was up there having a glass of wine with Moses and kicking it with Abraham, and he hears this voice that yanks him out of his eternal home, out of his heavenly mansion, and he has to come back to this world, I hope for his sake and ours, he was just asleep at this particular point in time. Because then it would be, a little bit better. If not, dude had to live every day thinking about, man, when I was dead, it was so much better. Man, when I wasn't alive, I didn't have to deal with these Romans. Come on now. But someday, at some point, we know he had to die. He had to die again. But because Jesus had stood on our side of the grave and said, Lazarus, come out, he knew that when he died again, Jesus would be on the other side of the grave saying, Lazarus, come home. Lazarus, come home. And the seed of hope that I pray gets planted in each and every one of us this morning is that when we die, we know that Jesus will be waiting there for us, calling our name and telling us to come home. And when we're sad, go ahead and cry. Let those tears flow, because they water the soil of your heart, wherein lies that seed of hope that one day Jesus will say, my child, my beloved child, I'm here, come home.